The great masters of the past have never really been able to get around this. Some of them will emphasize the bearing down aspect. Certainly the Buddha was in that camp. Some of them will emphasize the easing up aspect, like Papaji. I love the title of his book, Call Off the Search. That's my term for the sort of like ease up and stop striving for enlightenment. So the Buddha talked about the noble quest. Papaji talks about call off the search. Which one is right? Well, they're both right. So then the question, well, how do you know when to bear down? How do you know when to ease up? I don't have any magic formula for that. I can tell you how I, in my own teaching, attempt to deal with the paradox. My way of dealing with it is to give people techniques that allow them to bear down, that would emphasize that aspect, but also to give them a very clear description of how to practice in a non-efforting way. And the non-efforting practice, which you can read about on my websites, I call do nothing. It's basically my reworking of that whole choiceless awareness, dzogchen, just sit, what some people would call just sitting anyway, that whole approach to things, the call off the search approach. I call it do nothing. And so my way of dealing with the paradox is say, okay, I'm going to give you these techniques that involve noting, touch, sight, sound, or feel, image, talk, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some effort involved in that. You're trying to separate phenomena, and you're trying to soak your attention into the phenomenon when it arises. So here are some techniques that within which it's natural to somewhat bear down. Here's another approach which gives you a description of how to let go of the intention to do anything at all, without having an intention to let go of the intention, which is sort of tricky. But if you read the description of how to do nothing, you'll see how I try to get around that. I give people both approaches, and I encourage them to do both, to try both. My stock phrase is, if the noting makes you racy, then do nothing, as I define do nothing. If the do nothing makes you spacey, then go back to the noting. So now you have both approaches worked into the system, or worked into a system, so that they can sample both and work with both. I think because it is a paradox and because both are true, that the single most important thing is to not get one-sided. It's, and I see this all the time. Yes, indeed. One of the characteristic dangers that you can get with mindfulness practice is that people get goal-driven, and there is a drivenness in the way that they do it. You can actually get that in any spiritual practice. The medicine for that would be to learn that you don't have to practice that way. On the other hand, I have also seen people get addicted to the have no goal approach. They spend their whole life in daily life, they're unconscious and driven, but they're afraid to do any noting technique in their formal practice because somehow that's going to pollute their consciousness. They actually develop an aversion or a phobia of any bearing down whatsoever in formal practice. But as I say, it's sort of ridiculous because in daily life they're constantly giving they're constantly giving in to those kinds of forces of drivenness, but they're afraid to have any even hint of a goal in practice. Well, that's a kind of phobia. So I think that my way of trying to deal with this is, well, get familiar with both ways of working so that there's a kind of freedom that you could do either one. And in fact, I would say that the test for either of the approaches is your ability to do the other approach. So if you have been doing a high efforting approach, how do we know it's working? Well, you should be able to drop all effort if it worked and do a no effort, no meditation form of meditation. If you've been efforting and you claim that it's been successful and productive, then you should be able to do a non-effort practice without any problem at all. It works the other way too. If you claim that you have been productively doing a non-effort practice, a call-off-the-search practice, then the result of that should be that you have this very high concentration, clarity, and equanimity skills, even though you have had no particular goal to develop those in any systematic way. Therefore, the gold standard for testing, in my mind, the efficacy, the progress in a call-off-the-search approach would be, can you implement highly systematic focusing techniques like noting? Are you able and willing to do this? Well, then your call-off-the-search has been successful. Conversely, if you've been searching very hard and bearing down, that should result in the ability to completely let go of all direction and goal in practice. If not, then you've been making efforts without the progress that you should be making, and maybe you need to balance by doing the other approach.